Hey, welcome back. Hey, right now I'd like to tell you about one of the top 10 necro tourism destinations in the United States. I'd like to share a little bit of history, but I'd also like to tell you a little bit about my adventure there in 2019. The place that I am talking about is none other than Mount Vernon, the burial location of the first president of the United States, George Washington. George Washington died in January of 1799. And when Washington died, the Congress passed a resolution that they wanted to bury the first president in a crypt that was going to be 2 stories below the rotunda in the Capitol that was actually under construction at that time. Martha Washington thought it was a good idea, and she agreed with it as well. So while the construction was going on, Washington was placed in the family tomb, as were approximately 20 other members of the Washington family. Now, George Washington himself requested in his will that the family build a more elaborate tomb than the older tomb that they had overlooking the river. As a matter of fact, to quote him, the family vault at Mount Vernon requiring repairs and being improperly situated. Besides, I desire that a new one of brick and upon a larger scale may be built at the foot of what is commonly called the vineyard enclosure. And again, that was in his will. So around 1830, it was the 100th centennial of George Washington's birthday. So conversation was taking place again about having him buried in the rotunda of the Capitol, but again, that never happened. But another thing happened in 1830 was the Washington vault was vandalized and broken into when thieves were trying to get the skull of George Washington. Yes, you heard what I said, trying to get the skull of George Washington. Well, their plan failed because they ended up with the skull of his grandfather. After that happened, the grandson of George Washington, John Washington, decided to go ahead and build the tomb, or the vault rather, that we all see now, the family vault. So the Washingtons and the rest of the family were moved to this new grand brick enclosed vault in 1831. Now the sarcophagi that the Washingtons are in now were installed in 1837, and their bodies were placed inside. Now as you approach the main vault, there are 2 obelisks that are enclosed by black fences. Those are actually the markers for John Washington and his wife, as I mentioned, who was the grandson of George Washington, who actually had the vault built. Now, one of the other things that's on the grounds of the Mount Vernon estate is the slave cemetery. The slave cemetery is interesting because there's few things on that. Number one, there is a slave marker that identifies, this was done in 1929. This was a slave marker that recognized all the slaves that were buried from 1760 up until 1860 during that time period. Later on, excavations were done in that slave cemetery, and in 1983, researchers did more research and created a marker on the burial grounds. So the slave cemetery is a separate entity in of itself and needs to be checked out as well while you're on the Mount Vernon estate. Now, part of what I was mentioning about the marker that was put there for the slaves in 1929, that was done by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Now, they're a very important organization because once upon a time, the Washington family fell on hard times, that is, and in 1838, the Ladies Association purchased the property that is the Vernon estate, or Vernon Manor is, had it restored, and then allows it to be what it is and operates the things that go on now. As a matter of fact, they have tours there every day of the year, a tradition that was actually started by George Washington himself. Daily tours being available at Mount Vernon. Now, obviously, there's lots of things you can check out on the estate, the slaves' quarters, the actual house itself. You can go on guided tours. Of course, knowing what I do with the Necro Tourism, I was more concerned with the cemeteries and the burial areas. Mount Vernon was put on the National Historic Landmark list in 1960, and it became on the National Registry of Historic Places in 1966. It cost about $25 to get in, and if you are able to visit, it is definitely worth your time and a Necro tourist destination that definitely needs to be visited.